Man, I've been looking forward to this conversation since like well before the competition. As you were preparing for this, I was keeping an eye on your training and stuff like that, and I saw how good it was going, and I thought, man, I really hope Ross has an awesome competition because it'll make for a really good story, and I wanted to have a good way to frame up this conversation. Um, and I'm really glad that you did. So, I mean, I guess that's already starting to tell your story a little bit, but let's start with the competition that you had, and we'll kind of work our way backwards to get into training topics and things like that.
Yeah, it was great. It was one of the best meets of my life in a lot of different ways. I finally hit the 600-pound squat, the 272 and a half in competition. I had only ever done it in training before, and I was also, the time I did it in training when we were at the Arnold those years ago, I was 88 and a half kilos compared to 82 and a half kilos. So there's a significant difference there. So PR squat, PR deadlift at 282 and a half, PR total. And that was my first PR total since the Arnold in 2019. So it's been a long time since I had a PR in those ways because of a lot of like hardships in training and never really being like injured where I couldn't train, but enough where I couldn't push progress.
Yeah.
And I couldn't really train as hard and as meaningfully as I really wanted to. So it was really great to have that awesome like meet day and have the outcome come to fruition from a lot of really smart training choices leading into it. I also made a lot of really smart choices from a nutrition standpoint and body weight management that in the past really impacted my performance a lot. Typically in meets, I would have to regularly cut over like 3 to 3.5 kilos. In this meet, I set myself up with a much easier final water cut going into the meet, which was important because weigh-ins didn't happen until 1:30. And for me to wake up at 8 in the morning and go to 1:30 without food would be miserable. I don't want to fast. I'm not a faster. I'm an eater. So to be able to wake up that morning too and be light enough to be able to have some breakfast and eat some eggs was really important. And I was able to do that. And I played a very important role in the outcome of the meet.
Something that was really cool to me personally too. I mean, you're not new at this. You've been competing in powerlifting a long time, and to see you go to a competition, prepare well for it, things that were ready to derail you on the way, and come away with PRs. It gets harder and harder to do that.
Yeah.
And you've achieved a level where that's difficult, and you still did it. So that was really cool to see. I was personally like inspired by watching you lift. It was good. So I competed, somewhat recently now, is last month. And while I didn't have quite the day that you had, I was happy to be able to prepare for a competition, feel really healthy. I was telling people like it was the healthiest that I've felt in a competition prep that I could really remember. And I was right on the edge of hitting some of those number goals that I wanted to achieve. I remember, as I was doing that competition, you were kind of closing in on your prep for this competition, and we could see that things were going well. As we're kind of comparing notes, it was kind of cool to see that a lot of the things that we were doing were kind of the same things,
Right.
but we were coming at it from, more or less different worlds, and I guess to start off with, can you talk a little bit about some of the issues that you had and like how you were working around it?
Yeah. Some of the issues I was having, like the long-term injury that I was dealing with, was just this weird, tight, restricted, deep glute and hip discomfort. A lot of times in a squat, as I'd be descending right before I'd get to the hole, I'd feel just a little poke, and that was distracting. So especially at that point where you need to, for me in the way I squat, as I get closer to the hole, I really need to at that point start to hit some aggression, and that was causing a lot of hesitation at a point where I needed to turn up the aggression in my descent. And then in deadlift, like just above the knees, a lot of times I'd feel it click and kind of almost snap deep in the hip, and that was really distracting, and it didn't feel good, and it was a lot of the warning signs of slow down or you're going to get hurt really bad. And that was going on, and a lot of times I would troubleshoot and think that I had to have the problem solved and then start to dial training back up again, and it would come right back. And going through that ebb and flow of, oh, I'm good, no you're not, oh, I'm good, no you're not, for, man, felt like forever. And it was, I mean, it was a year and a half, 2 years like that. I did the abs pro in August last year, and I remember, when I got the invite, I'm like, I'm not ready for meet prep, but I don't want to say no to this opportunity. And that kind of prolonged it, because I went into meet prep mode instead of, I still probably wasn't quite ready to go into meet prep mode at that point, but I did anyway. And so that prolonged it a little bit, but that gives a timeline of about 2 years dealing with that. And it got to the point, what happened, there was a couple of things that were critical in finally kind of resolving it. One of the big ones from a training standpoint and volume and work in the program itself was, I got to the point where I realized I needed to give myself permission to just stop doing some of the work. I don't have problems with motivation and doing the training. I want to do the training. Even the Bulgarian split squats that nobody likes, that suck and they make you pain, they give you DOMs. I'm okay with that. So I needed to give myself permission to drop work. And it has been very intuitive, where I'm going along in training and I get to a point halfway through the volume work and I'm like, I don't really feel like any more is going to benefit me today. I'm done. And allowing myself to make those choices throughout the past year has been really beneficial. Even in the prep leading into nationals, I had 4 development blocks taken me into the meet. And the very first one, I hurt myself again, but in a different way. Week 2, on my very last set of my squat work for the day, I tweaked my adductor. And it was interesting because during that block, after that happened, I could continue squatting, but it bothered me on deadlifts, even though I tweaked it while I was squatting. Several weeks of that very first development block, I would warm up my deadlifts. It'd feel fine, it'd feel fine, it'd feel fine. I'd do my top set and it would feel like crap and I'd be done. So that first development block, all I ever did was my top set. I didn't do any of the volume work. It was enough to kind of hold the line, but never gain progress. But dialing everything back allowed it to get better. And then in the second block, it took off. And I was able to get more of the volume work in.
Those kinds of adjustments are really similar to a lot of the adjustments that I made as well. If you go back to February, when I competed at the PA Nationals, I did that competition injured. And I kind of had an idea of some of the changes that I wanted to make, which are really similar to the ones that you're talking about. Pretty much right after that, I implemented some of those changes. So for me, it's a similar approach, but it was very numbers oriented. I started tracking training stress across a bunch of different parameters. So like for me, I knew what type of mechanism it seemed to aggravate my injury. So it was certain exercises that put me in like the forward lean position. Talked about that before. So I said, what happens if I kind of manage that positional load the same way that you would do load management for, other things, your bench press or whatever. So I kind of applied that level of load management to it. So I may come into a lower body workout where I need to do, 4 working sets, but I know that I can only tolerate that forward lean position for 2 of those sets. So I would only do 2 sets of back squats, and then I would change to a different exercise and do something else. So that might be really similar, actually, like just a top set and then move on to something that's a little bit more friendly for my body for the remaining work. But it's interesting, we're kind of both pulling that lever, but yours was, my interpretation of it at least, is that yours was, you were thinking about, how am I feeling, what can I tolerate, what's going to be good for me and what's not. And I was just taking a very external, like numbers approach. And I wonder if that's maybe due to the nature of our injuries too. Like I tend to get no warning with it as well. Like it's just, oh, yep, that's messed up again.
Right.
love to know what you think about that.
Yeah, it's definitely been very intuitive based. And one of the other parts that's in the fold here that I think's cool, like how you talked about, there's not really any warning signs. I have had some warning signs. It's difficult to describe like the sensations of what those warning signs are. I would just have to characterize them as general low grade, like hip and adductor tightening. And I don't really feel access to like the range of motion that I would normally have. But it doesn't feel super restricted either. So it's weird to kind of describe, and that's why I say a lot of it for me needed to be intuitive based. One of the things that I found through some discovery that helps with that, that has helped and made a big impact to that, has been the sprinting. And I remember there was one day I was like, oh, I should do some sprint work. I used to do that many years ago in my powerlifting training, was sprinting, because I like to sprint fast. I like to be able to be fast. I went to go do that one day. I'm like, man, I feel so slow. Like I feel like I can't get to my top speed at all. Like takes forever.
Yeah.
And that's never been the case for me. I've always been able to get to my top end speed right away, really fast. Feeling that, I was like, man, there's something here that I need to address that I think will help fix some of these other things. And I noticed and was able to connect with that sprinting helped me. When I would start to feel some of those onsets, it was interesting in the training leading into nationals, there were some times where I'm like, oh man, I'm kind of starting to get a little tight. Well, I haven't done my sprint work in 2 weeks. We better make sure to prioritize the sprint work. And I'd go do the sprint work, and that would almost immediately help resolve some of the like onset symptoms.
So how are you managing the sprint work? What did those sessions look like for you?
It's funny, I don't track it. I go most of the time I'll go to the park down the road from the house. Sometimes I'll do it at the house. I just go sprint anywhere. Like it started out with 10-yard sprints. Just short, fast, quick burst work. And it has grown and elevated, and I'll do some 10-yard sprints to warm up and 20-yard sprints, and then I'll do some 40-yard sprints, and I'll increase the distance and increase how hard I'm sprinting, and the explosiveness if I'm trying to accelerate as fast as I can. But it's very intuitive too. And I'll go and I'll just start warming up and want to run hard and put in some hard work. And as I start to feel, kind of like in our training, when we start to, the RPE for the same load starts to increase and that fatigue is coming on, I'll look at it that way. Is my RPE for this 40-yard sprint increasing and detracting from my ability to perform that outcome and run as fast? And that's when I'll be like, okay, I think I'm good for the day. I'm not trying to get in the same kind of shape I was for football back when I played football. That's not the thing that I'm trying to do. I'm trying to do this, one, for general athleticism, and that I enjoy that. I perceive that as being healthy, is having that ability. So that's the thing that I'm trying to cultivate and have. Again, I'm not necessarily trying to become a professional sprinter. It's
Right.
just something to supplement my training. So I won't go that hard, push it past that extreme fatigue. My capacity for it has increased over time. Like I go and I'm able to do more before I get to that point where I feel like, oh, we're good.
So this is interesting to me. So make sure I understand correctly. So like you would go to one of these sprint sessions and keep it open-ended.
Mhm.
So the start off with a short distance, and that's kind of a warm up as well. You know, like shorter distances, lower efforts, and then gradually as you would warm up, you would increase those things. Just kind of being mindful of how you're feeling in that moment and paying attention to the level of effort required for a given performance. And when you start to notice that, hey, I've hit my peak performance for the day, now we're just kind of getting into volume work, you know.
Yeah.
Um, I've got what I need, time to move on.
Yep.
That's a cool way to do it. I heard a lot more from a lot more lifters lately about doing some definitely like not powerlifting type work, whether that be ab work, like direct ab work. It could still be things that you would recognize as lifting or training, but it would be things that are maybe further removed from powerlifting specific training. I'm coming in contact with more people who are seeing the value of those types of things, which, I mean, it's interesting to me because for having been around this for a long time, this is the ebb and flow of things, you know. Um, this used to be a facet of training that was talked about for a long time, and then it wasn't, and it was all specificity all the time.
Right.
And now I think that cohort of people, which I guess I would have to include myself in to some extent, has, I think, frankly, gotten older, and we start to see, hey, the way that we're going to keep seeing progress or seeing good results is not the same way that we got to where we're at now. I think that's an important thing. I hear from other top lifters who miss sprinting, who miss kind of their athletic background as well.
Yeah, I mean, and that was another big component to it too, and why I started to bring that back into the training. Wasn't the hip health was a big one, but it's also fun for me. I like to be fast. I like to sprint. It's fun. You know, I ran track in high school for a number of years and ran the 100-meter dash. I was win at it. It's not like I was a state champion sprinter, but it was something I had fun with. And it was a component of, you know, I want to do things that are also fun in training. That, as we've talked about in a lot of other places, that's one of the things that helps with longevity and helps with avoiding burnout, is doing the things that are fun that we enjoy doing. At the end of the day, this is a hobby, a sport. If it's not adding value to your life, why are you doing it?
I think a lot of us are willing to, frankly, willing to suffer for it. Right. If it means results. But the thing is, a lot of times it doesn't, and that's what trips a lot of people up. And I mean, it's tripped me up for a long time too. And for me, in this last prep that I did, mixing in other things was a really important part of that. And I think it's only going to be more of that as I continue to progress. I've got to the point where I can't imagine that, you know, doing more of the competition lift is going to yield that much more improvement. You know, especially like I'm thinking about my bench press right now, which has been kind of stagnant for a while, and I'm thinking, you know, doing more bench press, I can't imagine that that's going to be, you know, somehow any different than what I've been doing up to this point. It's got to be something else. And you talking about fun, and I think this is part of why the love-hate relationship that powerlifters have with accessory work is interesting. I think a lot of coaches perceive that powerlifters don't like accessory work, but my perception is that they kind of do. You know, there's a limit to anything. You know, you mentioned Bulgarian split squats. Yeah, most people don't like that, but lots of people like going in there and getting a pump. You know, right. Everybody's a little bit of a bodybuilder at heart, I guess, but I wonder to what extent that is beneficial, because you're still getting some work in, mixes things up and helps keep it fun. But in your case, it sounded like the sprint work wasn't just a fun aspect. It sounded kind of therapeutic even.
Definitely. You know, it connected me to, you know, I've had conversations with Mark about it before when I was having trouble making weight. Why don't you just move up a class? I'm like, yeah, you know, that's a legitimate question. If you're struggling to make weight, it's an obvious thing to consider, is moving up a class. And I've thought about it and I've kind of flirted with it. I don't feel athletic, and I don't feel healthy, and I don't feel like I can move about my life outside of training like I really want to. Anytime I seem to go into that 88-ish kilo range, every time I get into that range, there's something that's disconnected. And that's one of the main reasons why I don't want to ever, at least at this point, I've not ever wanted to move up. Would it be easier? Probably. Like, I wouldn't have to cut. That's always easier. But it connects me to something that's internally, intrinsically important to me, regardless of the sport of powerlifting. And that's where, like, the sprinting has done something like that for me, and being more to my core athletic, like, internal importance, rather than it just always being squat, bench, deadlift, squat, bench, deadlift. Like, those exercises are still fun. I don't want to give those up. But here's this thing that I've discovered that is also fun, is appearing to have a clear value add as well to the powerlifting. So it's honestly like it's a big win. And I'm sure if I took it to a further level, it could be a detractor, right? Like, in that moment when I'm going through those sprint workouts and I get to that point where I'm starting to feel that, you know, that short-term intra-set fatigue, so to speak. And if I were to, like, push past that, Because I could definitely push that harder. I think that's at that point then that it would also take away from the powerlifting instead of add to the powerlifting. So I think that's been a neat little balancing point to find too. And that's also helped me be in better touch with those intuitive choices of another set here is probably not going to be beneficial for me. Let's go ahead and we'll just be good for the day.
You know, the way that you talk about your sprint work reminds me of the way that I felt about the front squat work that I was doing more in the thick of my injury period. It felt beneficial to my lifting in a lot of different ways. You know, mentally, that it was something that I could push hard on, not have any sort of negative consequences. It was a way that I could train and be strong, and it felt like there was measurable direct transfer, you know, back to the competitive power lifts. So I could spend more time doing things that agreed with me, some amount of time training the power lifts. But it all seemed to work better when it was mixed together than either one of them would be apart. Your approach being more of a, I guess, more of an intuitive approach, do you feel like that's something that's teachable? Could you teach that to your athletes?
I think you can teach it, but I think it does require certain personality types. You know, a lot of times we talk about neuroticism. I think if you're higher on the neuroticism scale, you're going to have a harder time adjusting on the fly. You're going to be better supported in your training if you have a more reliable schedule. This creates a degree of uncertainty. And I think that's one of the things that can be trigger some anxiety for somebody that might be a little higher on the neuroticism is that level of uncertainty. Like, what am I going to do going into this training? Am I going to be able to do all the work or not? And that uncertainty can be difficult to deal with. And that's something that for me on my own mental health personal journey has my capacity to handle uncertainty has increased a lot in my life. That used to be something that I had a very difficult time handling. So, like having that characteristic in your personality can be really beneficial. I think the other component to it is just being able to read and understand and be in tune with your body and the different sensations and being aware of them. If you don't have that awareness, it's going to be really difficult. And learning to pay attention to those signs and signals along the way, they can be difficult to learn how to read. It also is going to require experience. I don't see that as being something that you would be able to teach a novice lifter out of the gate. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's a way to do it, but I can't quite visualize how I would do that with somebody who hasn't been lifting for several years. 27 years for me, and I've gone through all different kinds of periods of training, and this is kind of like one of those things that has evolved primarily because of the length of experience and going through a lot of different types and styles of training. Like going through those different experiences that helps cultivate that awareness to know.
That reminds me a lot of that I used to hear a lot when I was coming up as a coach, was people would say you have to learn how to listen to your body. You don't hear it as much anymore, but the thing that I would hear is people would say, oh, well, it just takes a long time to learn how to do that. You've got to spend 10 years or whatever it would be paying attention, and then you just kind of figure it out along the way, which I do see that, you know, like how do you know the difference between soreness and an injury, a minor injury, without having experienced both of them now and then? How do you know what a 10 RPE feels like if you never go there? A lot of those things are experiential and they're judged in reference to something. It would be nice if there was a different way to go about some of that, to know what that felt like ahead of time so you never had to go through it. But I don't know what that would look like. I can't imagine it at this point anyway.
Yeah, it's definitely really tough to know what discomfort and pain do I need to push through and which discomfort and pain do I need to respect and pull back from, because they are very easy to mix up. Maybe you ease back from discomfort you need to lean into, and now you just stagnated progress. You just missed the opportunity to gain and elevate your training. Like I've consumed some of David Goggins' work and some of Cameron Haynes' work, and you know, anybody that isn't familiar with them, both of those two do a lot of ultra marathons. You know, Cameron Haynes ran the Moab 250, a 250-mile race, and he talks about his thing is like I'm just really good at embracing pain and pushing through pain. And I want to see how far can I do that. And I think about stuff like what he's done with that. And I think about it in relation to powerlifting. I'm like, that's so interesting because there's so many parts in powerlifting where you push through some of that pain and you train to muscle failure as frequently as he does, and you're going down. It's not going to benefit you. So it's interesting to think about. You're going to have pain along the way. And there are certain pains that you need to learn to push through and embrace to find what's on the other side, and some pains that you don't. It's really hard to categorize them, to give them to a list of somebody who isn't experiencing them. I think for me, probably the biggest thing at this point, if it feels like it's in the muscle belly, I'm going through it. If it feels like it's in the joint, I'm pulling back.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of times when been true for me, and then other times when it's not been as well, which I mean just kind of goes back to your larger point of there's an experiential component to this. I mean, I think there's a guidance component too, you know, that other experienced people can help you along the way, but nobody knows what your leg feels like except for you, and words are kind of a clumsy way to describe it. But you know, another thing you were talking about, people lifters and their neuroticism. We're talking about trait neuroticism, by the way, which is kind of volatility of emotions. Like you experience a negative event, how impactful is that on your emotional state? You know, does it create a lot of negative emotions or a small amount of negative emotions? So that's kind of trait neuroticism. But you were kind of connecting that to individuals' willingness to be flexible and kind of a go with the flow type of plan. That's definitely been the kind of planning that I've been doing for myself, and a lot of my athletes, even healthy ones. More recently, it has been a more flexible approach because I think that that's just how bodies are. You know, if we know that, you know, your recovery rate is in flux, we know that, you know, your training is never exactly according to plan. You know, things are always a little bit more or a little bit less or a little bit longer or shorter or something. We know that we can't predict exactly the outcomes of any of this, that it's all just a nudge in the right direction, and we're going to have to course correct. Well, let's actually make those course corrections and let's be flexible with how we're planning. Man, that makes some people uncomfortable. I honestly think that that's a training liability. I think things would just be better if you could get past that, you know. And I've had lifters who have told me, you know, well, I really don't feel comfortable, you know, with this amount of flexibility. I want Monday to be squat day, and I kind of don't care what I feel like. And look, I get it because I'm that way too, more than I'd like to admit, maybe. You know, like I still hold on to a lot of that stuff, but I do see how it would be better if I wasn't, you know, tied to a arbitrary 7-day week or whatever the case might be, you know. So I just kind of wanted to put that on record that I think it would be better for athletes if they had some more mental flexibility and were able to kind of flex with the plan, you know, take what your body's given you instead of like just being committed to what's on the paper. Like being committed to your training is good, but you got to understand that what's on the paper is hopefully a good idea, but it's not predictive of how you're going to respond to any of it.
That's a fun point and something to dig around on. For context and background, Mike wrote my training for many years, well over 5 years. You were working on a lot of those systems to have that adaptive volume and change the exercises based on where the recovery was and different things of that nature with me towards the end of you writing my training. And I struggled with it. I struggled with that flexibility. I wanted my squat session on Monday. I wanted my deadlift on Tuesday, and I was attached to that. And it was interesting the struggles that I had with the flexibility from the system that you were creating. That was also during a lot of the times of my hip and the ebb and flow of the hip. Like I said, the reason I needed to take over my own training was because I needed to connect with that intuitive part. And for me, the only way that I felt like I could connect with that intuitive part was if I just took over my training and wrote it sometimes on the fly. So it's very similar again, but yet a little
Yeah.
bit different.
Totally, totally.
So I wonder, what is it? What's the thing that allows me to do that intuitively with that flexibility, but not guided from somebody else?
Yeah.
And it's somebody that I trust and respect and admire at the same time too. It's not like you're somebody that I didn't have a relationship with.
Right.
You know, you had my trust and buy-in. I got and understood the concepts and ideas that you're talking about, but I struggled so hard with implementing it and
Yeah.
doing it.
Well, you're definitely not the only one, first of all. And I mean, it's like I tell my athletes now, there's a line to be walked here, right? Because what I've built in the system that I'm still experimenting with, it's all on a spreadsheet currently. And I tell my athletes all the time, don't let the spreadsheet tell you to do something stupid. It's a spreadsheet, can hopefully guide our decisions, hopefully give us good ideas, but ultimately we have to be the decision makers. And that's tough, right? It's a tough balance to strike. And I mean, this comes back to, I mean, I guess for me, that's an intuitive balance. You know, how do you know the difference? Hopefully you can just kind of use your judgment and figure it out.
Right.
Um, and I still do, there's a certain amount of that kind of exertion of control. You know, I want squat day to be on Monday kind of thing. This seems like it's fine. I generally do that. I think most of my athletes now generally, you know, they for their comp lifts especially, like they kind of have the day that it almost always falls on that day, and it seems to be a good thing. There does need to be exceptions to it, but then I've got some athletes, and it's like when we start to exert too much control over that process, things are going sideways, and let go of some of it, you know, in order and kind of let the process take care of itself. Like, for example, the system knows how much work you've done. And so it knows like what's a normal amount of work for you. It knows generally how much recovery, you know, how well recovered are you. And so we can adjust our volume target based on recovery and your individual workload baselines. Some people feel like that's not enough work. You know, they're doing the work and they're like, I just don't feel like I'm getting enough squatting in. Well, there's ways in the system that are built in that we can override that and give them more squatting work. That tends to not work. We give them more work, they feel like they need more work, so we just turn up the dial, and it tends to not work that well. But if we can develop them into doing more work, it takes longer, and we've got to be patient through that process, but it seems to be more effective. I don't know, it's interesting. Like, why would one method be more productive than the other? Like, it from a mechanistic standpoint, like your body doesn't know that we just put a 9 in that box instead of an 8, you know. Right. But it seems to matter.
Yeah. I think that, like a lot of things, the degree of certainty of the things they're just outside your control. Often think back to the engineering days. We would get clients a lot of times that would be like, hey, we want you to design this building so that we never have to shovel the roof when it snows. And we have to say, that's not possible. There's no, I can't ever do anything with zero probability. One, you don't have enough money. Two, that's unconstructible. Yeah, we could make it so that you probably won't have to ever do it, but it's going to be really expensive and more timely and all those things. Like, we can't, there's just so many levels and degrees of uncertainty that exist in our world in so many ways that there's no way that you can account for all those variables.
I'm sure there's more questions that I'll have for you, but I know where to reach you. I think all of our listeners know where to reach you as well. So I just wanted to say congratulations on your competition. I was really excited to see you have that kind of day, and I'm glad to hear too that this is the kind of competition that sticks with you for a while. So that's good. And thanks for having this conversation with me. It's always nice to compare notes.
Yeah, thank you. It was good. It's fun
Thanks
to meet.
everybody for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time.